Good morning, everyone. Brett Kavanaugh speaking from my chambers on what's already shaping up to be the most constitutionally significant morning of Trump's presidency. So I'm sitting here with my extra strong coffee, and I mean extra strong because what I learned yesterday in an emergency Supreme Court conference has kept me up all night when I realized the American people need to understand what's really happening with these January 6th pardons. The media is calling it everything from constitutional crisis to healing the nation, but what I'm about to tell you is based on classified legal briefs, emergency judicial conferences, and constitutional analysis that goes to the very heart of presidential power versus rule of law. And folks, this isn't just about January 6th anymore. This is about whether America will have constitutional government or presidential monarchy. Justice, the emergency Supreme Court conference. Yesterday at 3 p.m., Chief Justice Roberts called an extraordinary emergency conference. Not a public session, not on our official calendar, just the 9 justices in our private conference room discussing what he called the most serious constitutional challenge to judicial authority in modern American history. The reason? 3 separate legal challenges to Trump's pardon authority are racing toward our court, and we're being asked to make decisions that will either affirm or destroy the constitutional balance of powers. Colleagues, Roberts begins, we need to discuss the constitutional implications of mass presidential pardons for crimes against the constitutional order itself. What follows is the most intense legal discussion I've ever participated in as a justice. Because we're not just talking about pardoning individuals, we're talking about pardoning an entire political movement that challenged the peaceful transfer of power. The constitutional dilemma, Justice Thomas immediately raises the core issue. The Constitution gives the president virtually unlimited pardon power. Article 2, Section 2 is clear. He shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. But, Justice Alito interjects, can that power be used to pardon crimes committed in service of keeping the president in power? Doesn't that create a constitutional paradox? And that's exactly the dilemma we're facing. The January 6 prosecutions weren't just about criminal behavior. They were about attempts to prevent the constitutional transfer of presidential power. If a president can pardon people for crimes committed to keep him in power, then presidential power becomes self-reinforcing and potentially unlimited. Justice Gorsuch puts it bluntly. Are we establishing precedent that presidents can pardon their way out of constitutional accountability? I first say, the legal briefs, we can't discuss. What I can tell you without violating judicial confidentiality is that we've received legal briefs from the Justice Department that are unlike anything I've seen in 6 years on the court. These aren't normal criminal law briefs. These are constitutional crisis briefs that argue presidential pardon power has never been tested against crimes designed to subvert presidential transitions. One brief argues that pardons for January 6th offenses would create a constitutional impossibility, using constitutional power to undermine constitutional governance. Another brief argues that the founders never intended pardon power to protect seditious conspiracy against the constitutional order itself. But here's what really gets my attention. Several briefs argue that if these pardons are upheld, future presidents will have unlimited power to pardon anyone who commits crimes in service of presidential power. That's not constitutional government. That's exactly what the founders were trying to prevent when they created checks and balances. Here's the self-pardon question. Then Chief Justice Roberts drops the real bombshell. We also need to discuss the possibility that President Trump may attempt to pardon himself for any federal charges related to January 6th. The room goes silent because a presidential self-pardon would shatter every constitutional precedent we have. Justice Kavanaugh, that's me, raises the obvious question, can someone be the judge in their own case? That violates the most basic principle of due process. Justice Barrett adds, if presidents can pardon themselves, then presidential power has no legal limits. They become immune to federal criminal law. The Constitution doesn't explicitly prohibit self-pardons, but constitutional logic makes them impossible. You cannot grant yourself legal immunity. That's the definition of tyranny. But here's the problem. If Trump attempts a self-pardon, the Supreme Court will have to rule on whether American presidents are above the law. The intelligence briefing. After our conference, I received what's called a judicial intelligence briefing from the FBI. These are extremely rare, usually only provided when cases involve national security implications. What the FBI told me changes how I understand the entire January 6th situation. Justice Kavanaugh, the briefing officer says, we have evidence that some January 6 participants were in direct communication with foreign intelligence services. He shows me documents indicating that certain January 6th organizers had connections to Russian intelligence assets, that some participants received funding from sources connected to foreign governments, and that foreign disinformation campaigns actively promoted January 6th activities. If President Trump pardons individuals who were working with foreign intelligence services to disrupt American democracy, the officer continues, he would essentially be pardoning foreign intelligence operations against the United States. This raises the stakes dramatically. We're not just talking about domestic political violence, we're talking about presidential pardons for what may have been foreign-influenced attacks on American constitutional government. Nardan, the constitutional history. I spent yesterday evening researching historical precedents for presidential pardons of political violence, and what I found is disturbing. The closest historical parallel is President Andrew Johnson's pardons of Confederate leaders after the Civil War. Those pardons were enormously controversial and contributed to Johnson's impeachment. But even Johnson never pardoned people for crimes committed to keep him personally in power. The founders discussed pardon power extensively in the Constitutional Convention, and they specifically worried about presidents using pardons to protect their own political interests. Alexander Hamilton argued in Federalist 74 that pardon power was safe because the sense of responsibility would prevent abuse. But what happens when a president feels no responsibility to constitutional constraints? The deep state response. What I learned from intelligence sources is that career Justice Department officials are preparing for what they call constitutional resistance to January 6th pardons. If President Trump pardons individuals who committed crimes against constitutional government, one career prosecutor explains to me, federal law enforcement officers have a constitutional duty to determine whether such pardons are legally valid. They're essentially arguing that some pardons might be so fundamentally unconstitutional that federal agents could refuse to honor them. We took an oath to defend the Constitution, the prosecutor continues, not to follow unconstitutional presidential orders, even if they're issued through the pardon power. This sets up a direct confrontation between presidential authority and law enforcement independence. Now, the foreign policy implications. Something most people don't realize. Presidential pardons for January 6th, participants would have massive foreign policy implications. Yesterday, I spoke with a State Department official who's worked on democracy promotion for 15 years. Justice, he says, how can we criticize authoritarian leaders who pardon their political supporters if American presidents do the same thing? We've spent decades promoting rule of law and democratic accountability around the world. Presidential pardons for political violence would undermine every democracy promotion effort we have, but more importantly, Allied intelligence services are asking whether they can trust American commitments to constitutional governance if American presidents can pardon attacks on constitutional government. This isn't just domestic constitutional law, it's about America's credibility as a constitutional democracy. The January 20th timeline. Chief Justice Roberts also briefed us on the timeline we're facing. Several January 6th pardons are expected on January 20th, Inauguration Day itself. The symbolism, Roberts notes, is that President Trump would begin his presidency by pardoning people convicted of trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power. But the legal implications are more serious than symbolic. If pardons are issued immediately upon taking office, there won't be time for legal challenges before they take effect. We could face a situation, Roberts explains, where hundreds of January 6th participants are released from prison before the courts can review whether their pardons are constitutionally valid. This means the Supreme Court might have to issue emergency stays of presidential pardons, something that's never happened in American history. Dear the congressional factor, what makes this even more complicated? Some members of Congress were involved in January 6th planning, and some could potentially be pardoned by President Trump. Yesterday, I had lunch with a senator who serves on the Judiciary Committee, can't tell you which one, and they explained the congressional dilemma. If President Trump pardons members of Congress for January 6th related activities, they tell me, those same members of Congress would then be voting on legislation and judicial confirmations. You'd have members of Congress who owe their freedom to presidential pardons making decisions about presidential power. That's a fundamental conflict of interest. But here's the constitutional problem. The Constitution gives Congress authority over its own members through expulsion powers, but presidential pardons could undermine that authority. The public opinion dimension. Something I never thought I'd have to consider as a Supreme Court justice, how public reaction to our decisions might affect constitutional stability. Justice Breyer raised this concern in our conference. If we uphold broad January 6th pardons, half the country will see it as legitimizing political violence. If we strike them down, half the country will see it as partisan judicial activism. This puts the court in an impossible position. Constitutional law shouldn't be determined by public opinion, but constitutional stability requires public acceptance of judicial authority, and if the public loses faith in Supreme Court legitimacy, the entire constitutional system becomes unstable. My constitutional analysis. As someone who's spent my entire career studying constitutional law, I have to tell you, presidential pardons for January 6th participants would create constitutional precedents that are genuinely dangerous for American democracy. The Constitution gives presidents broad pardon power, but that power was designed to serve constitutional purposes: mercy, justice, and national reconciliation. Using pardon power to protect political supporters who committed crimes against constitutional government perverts the purpose of presidential clemency. More importantly, it creates incentives for political violence. If presidents can pardon supporters who commit crimes in service of presidential power, then constitutional constraints on presidential authority become meaningless. The international perspective. I also spoke with constitutional scholars from other democracies to understand how they view American presidential pardon power. A British constitutional expert told me, in parliamentary systems, chief executives can't pardon crimes against the constitutional order because they don't have independent pardon authority. The American system assumes presidential restraint that may no longer exist, he continues. A German constitutional scholar was even more direct. If American presidents can pardon attacks on democratic institutions, then America is no longer a constitutional democracy in any meaningful sense. These international perspectives matter because constitutional democracy is ultimately about international credibility as much as domestic legitimacy. Chakr Sat, the Supreme Court's dilemma. Here's our impossible situation. We have to rule on the constitutionality of presidential pardons that could determine whether America remains a constitutional democracy. If we uphold broad January 6th pardons, we establish precedent that presidents can use pardon power to protect political supporters who commit violence against constitutional government. If we strike down presidential pardons, we limit constitutional presidential power in ways that could affect legitimate uses of clemency authority. Either decision will be seen as partisan by roughly half the country, which undermines Supreme Court legitimacy that's essential for constitutional stability. The foreign intelligence angle. Yesterday evening, I received another intelligence briefing that really disturbed me. Intelligence officials believe that foreign adversaries are actively hoping for broad January 6th pardons. Foreign intelligence services, the briefing officer explains, view January 6th pardons as evidence that American constitutional government is fundamentally unstable. They're using potential pardons in their propaganda to argue that American democracy is a facade, that political violence is acceptable in America, and that American criticism of authoritarian practices is hypocritical. But more concerning, some foreign intelligence services may be preparing to exploit the precedent of January 6th pardons to justify their own political violence. If American presidents can pardon attacks on constitutional government, authoritarian leaders worldwide will use that precedent to justify suppressing democratic opposition. The constitutional future. Looking ahead, here's what really worries me. If January 6th pardons are upheld, future presidents will have unlimited power to pardon political supporters who commit crimes in service of presidential power. That creates a constitutional system where presidential authority is self-reinforcing rather than constrained by law. Future presidents could encourage political violence, then pardon participants. They could use federal law enforcement against political opponents, then pardon collaborating officials. They could violate constitutional constraints, then pardon enablers. That's not constitutional government. It's precisely the kind of tyranny the founders designed the Constitution to prevent. Shakyo, what this means for America. The January 6th pardon decisions will determine whether America continues to be governed by constitutional law or presidential will. If presidents can pardon crimes committed to keep them in power, then constitutional constraints on presidential authority become voluntary rather than mandatory. If constitutional constraints are voluntary, then we no longer have constitutional government. We have presidential discretion constrained only by political considerations. That's exactly what the founders feared when they created checks and balances, separation of powers, and rule of law. Is my personal struggle. As I sit here in my Supreme Court chambers, I'm facing the most difficult constitutional questions of my career. How do I balance respect for presidential pardon power with protection of constitutional government? How do I separate legal analysis from political considerations when the two are so intertwined? How do I make decisions that preserve both presidential authority and constitutional constraints? These aren't academic questions anymore. These are practical challenges that will determine America's constitutional future. And just the choice ahead. The Supreme Court's decisions on January 6th, pardons will be among the most important constitutional rulings in American history. Will either establish precedents that protect constitutional government from presidential abuse, or will establish precedents that make constitutional government subject to presidential discretion. The American people deserve to understand what's at stake. This isn't just about January 6 or Donald Trump. It's about whether America will remain a constitutional democracy. Looking forward, I can't predict how the court will rule on these cases, but I can tell you this. Our decisions will be based on constitutional law and constitutional precedent, not political preferences or public pressure. The Constitution must mean what it says, regardless of whether particular outcomes are politically popular or personally comfortable. But I hope the American people understand that constitutional government requires more than judicial enforcement. It requires political commitment to constitutional principles. If political leaders stop believing in constitutional constraints, judicial enforcement becomes impossible. Thanks for listening, folks. This was one of the most difficult conversations I've ever had to have because it reveals how close America is to a fundamental constitutional crisis. Next week, we'll discuss the legal precedents that will guide Supreme Court decisions on presidential pardon power. Until then, remember that constitutional government depends on all of us, not just judges, respecting constitutional limits on political power. So, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, December 2024, Washington, D.C. Disclaimer, these views represent personal constitutional analysis and do not reflect official Supreme Court positions or deliberations.